I'd like to spend a few minutes and talk about growth-influenced results. This is actually part 2 of the results of self-limiting proposition perspective. There's another video already out there somewhere called part 1, goal-influenced results. In this part, I want to talk about results as a result of a reinforcing structure. A reinforcing structure is simply any structure where activity produces a result which encourages more of the same activity. In this structure, I went ahead and stuck progress so I could compare the current state with a reference state to get some sense of what the progress has been since the time that the activity was initiated. This is, again, a simulation model which you can interact with, change the variables and do simulations. But in this particular segment, if you look at just this structure itself, it produces an exponential growth curve. And a comment about exponential growth curves, which people seldom don't realize, is the exponential growth curve always has the same structure. So that if you simply looked at a small piece of this curve and blew it up, you would see the same curve. Typically, exponential growth curves don't get our attention until they get very large, but the structure of the curve itself is always the same. It's always demonstrating exponential growth. Now, in this particular instance, this is typically unrealistic in that activity is typically limited by some resource. Nothing grows independent of everything. Any growth that happens has to consume some resources. So there's always a limit to growth. If you don't sense it at the moment, you can be sure that you will run into one sooner or later. A comment that I often make is that if everything is going exactly the way that you want it to, it's time to worry and to go start looking for limits, because sooner or later you're going to run into them because nothing grows forever. But if we go ahead and simply stick resources in here as a limiting factor on activity, and we set this up and we make resources a value of 0.2, you notice that until such time as the growth runs into the resource limit, it is demonstrating an exponential growth, but then once it runs into the limit, it grows in a linear fashion because it's governed by the resources available as opposed to the reinforcing factor. Now, also what happens more often than not is that as growth progresses, as results develop, there's a sense of enough that often comes into play, whereby those involved get a sense that we've done enough. We've produced enough results, and the activity begins to be limited by this sense of enough as opposed to by resources. So that what happens is that there's an exponential growth, and then at a certain point, once the resource limit is reached, once the sense of enough is reached, where's enough? All right, it begins to have an impact, and the activity declines, so that growth continues, but it's governed by the activity which is declining. So even though the activity is declining, results are still being produced, but the sense of enough comes into play and has a tendency to limit the activity. So what's often appropriate is to go ahead and reset this reference state periodically so that the difference between where we think we started and where we are, we have in fact, it's not as large, and therefore enough doesn't come into play. So I've actually seen this structure in effect numerous times, and each time it happened, the people involved in it were sort of caught off guard because they were looking at a situation where the activity should have been governed by the resources, but as it turned out, it wasn't. It was governed by the participants involved believing that enough was enough, and so that they began to use that sense of enough to limit the activity and influence the growth less and less. So, as I said, this is the second part of results of self-limiting perspective, and in here you can access both the models, the videos, and interact with them and provide comments based upon what you think of this perspective. And I invite you to join us by sending your Kumu username to systemswiki@gmail.com. And if you don't have a Kumu username, you can get one at kumu.io/signup. And if you haven't seen the introductory video for the Perspectives project, there is one at systemswiki.org. So I'll see you in another video shortly. Bye.